Some storms don't come to destroy, they come to bring something back. The wind that night carried a strange weight, the kind that pressed against the chest and made even silence feel loud. And somewhere along a narrow county road just outside a forgotten lakeside town, a man who had already lost more than he could name sat behind the wheel of an old Ford pickup, engine idling low, headlights cutting thin beams through sheets of rain that seemed determined to erase everything in sight. His name was Daniel Hayes, 40 years old, a former Army engineer who had learned long ago how quickly the ground beneath a man could disappear, and beside him, steady as breath, sat Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a coat of ash gray and cream, ears high, eyes alert in a way that never truly rested, the kind of awareness that came from years of training, but also something deeper, something instinctive, something Daniel had stopped trying to explain. The storm had rolled in faster than expected, thunder distant but growing, wind bending the pines along the roadside until their branches scraped against one another like old bones whispering in the dark. Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel, not out of fear, but out of habit, because storms like this didn't just bring rain, they brought memories, and memories were the one thing he had never fully learned how to outrun. Rex shifted suddenly, his body stiffening, a low sound forming in his chest, not quite a growl, not quite a warning, but something in between, something older. Daniel glanced over, noticing the way the dog's ears angled forward, his gaze fixed not on the road ahead, but somewhere off to the right, beyond the curtain of rain where visibility dropped to almost nothing. "Easy, boy," Daniel murmured, his voice calm, but carrying a thread of tension he couldn't quite hide. Rex didn't relax. Instead, he let out 3 short, sharp barks, each one precise, measured, the same pattern he had used years ago when something wasn't just wrong, but needed attention. Immediate attention. Daniel felt the shift in his chest before he even made the decision, the kind of shift that didn't come from logic but from something deeper, something that had kept him alive when logic failed. He eased his foot off the brake, letting the truck roll slowly forward before turning the wheel toward the narrow gravel path Rex seemed so intent on. The tires crunched against loose stone as they veered off the main road, branches scraping along the sides of the truck, rain hitting the windshield in relentless waves, visibility dropping to barely 20 feet. But Rex remained focused, his body leaning forward as if guiding the vehicle itself, as if he could already see what waited ahead. Daniel followed without question, because over the years, he had learned one simple truth. Rex never reacted without reason. The path curved sharply, leading toward a cluster of old homes barely visible through the storm, most of them dark, abandoned or asleep, their windows black and lifeless, but one stood slightly apart, its porch light flickering weakly against the wind, the structure itself worn, its wooden frame groaning under the pressure of the storm. And just as Daniel brought the truck to a stop, Rex barked again, louder this time, urgency cutting through the sound of rain. Daniel killed the engine and stepped out into the storm, the cold hitting him instantly, soaking through his jacket within seconds. But he barely noticed, because something else had taken hold, something familiar, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. Rex moved ahead, paused steady despite the mud, heading straight toward the house, his nose low, then lifting, tracking something unseen. Daniel followed, boots sinking slightly into the wet ground, the wind pushing against him as if trying to hold him back. The porch creaked as they approached, a loose shutter slammed violently against the wall, and for a moment, everything seemed suspended between noise and silence, between chaos and something waiting just beneath it. Then Rex stopped, his body going still, ears forward, eyes locked on the front steps. Daniel's breath slowed as he stepped closer, his senses sharpening in a way he hadn't felt in years, and beneath the roar of the storm, just barely, almost lost to the wind, there it was, a faint sound, fragile, human, a voice calling for help, not loud, not desperate, but persistent, as if it had been waiting, not for anyone, but for someone who would actually listen. Daniel didn't hesitate, because some moments don't give you time to think, they only give you the choice to act. And as he moved toward that sound, with Rex already one step ahead, something deep inside him stirred, something he thought had been buried long ago, because sometimes the storm doesn't bring the danger, sometimes it brings the Chance you didn't know you were still waiting for. The porch boards groaned beneath Daniel's boots as he climbed the short set of steps, each movement deliberate, steady, the way he had learned to move when every second mattered but panic could cost more than time. The wind pushed hard against his back, rain soaking through his flannel and denim in cold, relentless waves, but Rex was already there, standing at the front door, body tense, ears forward, his gaze fixed low near the base of the frame. Daniel followed that gaze and saw it. The door was slightly ajar, not wide, just enough for the storm to force its way inside in thin, whistling drafts. He reached for the handle and pushed gently. The hinges creaked in protest, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the storm behind him. And as the door opened, the air inside felt different, not warmer exactly, but still, as if the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting. "Hello," Daniel called out, his voice steady but softened by something unspoken. There was no immediate answer, only the faint rattle of something loose somewhere deeper inside. And then again, that voice, weaker now, but real, coming from somewhere beyond the narrow hallway. Rex moved first, stepping carefully across the threshold, his paws silent against the worn wooden floor, nose lifting, tracking the source with quiet certainty. Daniel closed the door behind them to keep the wind from tearing it loose, and the sudden drop in noise made the silence inside feel almost heavy. Each step down the hallway echoed faintly, the walls lined with old photographs, their edges curled with age, glimpses of a life, once full now dimmed by time. Daniel's eyes flickered across them without slowing, his focus narrowing. The voice came again, a soft, strained call, and this time it guided him to a side room where part of the ceiling had sagged, a fallen beam resting at an angle near the window, rain slipping through a crack above and dripping steadily onto the floor. And there, partially shielded by an overturned chair, lay an elderly woman, her silver hair damp against her forehead, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to shift her weight, not trapped beyond hope, but clearly unable to rise on her own. Daniel crossed the room in 2 quick strides, dropping to one knee beside her. "It is all right. I have got you," he said, his voice calm, grounded, the way it had been in places far from here, places where fear needed something steady to hold on to. Her eyes found his, pale blue, sharp despite the strain, and for a moment, something passed between them, recognition, not of who he was, but of what he had come to do. Rex circled once, then settled close at her side, his body angled in quiet support, his presence steadying the moment in a way words could not. Daniel assessed quickly, no urgency beyond what time could handle, no need for panic, just careful movement. He slid one arm behind her shoulders, the other beneath her arm, lifting slowly, allowing her to find her balance as her weight shifted toward him. She winced slightly, but did not cry out, her grip on his sleeve tightening just enough to show she trusted the motion. Step by step, he guided her toward a sturdier chair near the far wall, one that had not been touched by the shifting beam or the rain. Rex stayed close, his head tilted slightly, as if listening for something beyond the room, something deeper. Once she was seated, Daniel moved quickly but without rush, adjusting the fallen beam just enough to relieve the pressure on the structure, closing the cracked window to keep the rain from worsening the damage, his movements efficient, practiced, the rhythm of someone who had rebuilt more than he had ever spoken about. When he returned to her, she was watching him, not with fear, but with a quiet, measuring calm. "You came through that storm," she said, softly, her voice thin but steady. Daniel gave a small nod, brushing rainwater from his brow. "My dog heard you," he replied, and at that, her gaze shifted to Rex, who met it without hesitation, ears forward, eyes steady, and something in her expression changed, softened, as if a question she had been holding for a long time had just found its answer. She leaned back slightly in the chair, her breath evening out. And though the storm still raged beyond the walls, inside that room, something had already begun to settle, something quieter, something that felt less like chance and more like a moment that had been waiting longer than either of them could understand. And Daniel, standing there with rain still dripping from his sleeves, felt it too, the faint but undeniable sense that this was not where the night would end, only where something had finally begun. The storm continued its steady rhythm against the walls, But inside the house the air had shifted into something quieter, almost reflective, as if the noise outside had been left at the threshold, and what remained within was something far more deliberate. Daniel pulled a worn blanket from the back of a nearby chair and draped it gently over the woman's shoulders, the fabric thin but dry, carrying the faint scent of cedar and thyme. She adjusted it with slow hands, her fingers slightly unsteady. But purposeful, Rex remained at her side. His body relaxed now, but his eyes still watchful, tracking subtle movements in the room that Daniel could not yet perceive. "You should not have come out in weather like this," she said after a moment, her voice stronger now. Though still touched by fatigue, Daniel gave a small shrug, glancing briefly toward the window where rain traced uneven paths down the glass. "Storms do not usually wait for better timing," he replied, his tone quiet, not dismissive but familiar, as if he had long accepted that some things in life simply arrived when they chose to, not when one was ready. She studied him again, not in the way strangers often did, but with a depth that suggested she was looking beyond what stood in front of her, as if measuring something unseen. "You have been through worse," she said softly. It was not a question. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the small kitchen area, checking the cabinets until he found a kettle and a box of tea, the simple act grounding him, giving his hands something to do while his mind stayed just far enough from where it tended to wander. He filled the kettle from the tap and set it on the stove, the click of the burner catching after a second try, a small blue flame flickering to life. The sound was quiet but steady, and in that steadiness there was comfort. Behind him, Rex shifted, his claws making a faint sound against the wood as he moved toward the far corner of the room, his nose low, tracing along the floorboards with focused intent. Daniel noticed, but did not interrupt. He had learned to let the dog follow what called to him, because Rex did not search without reason. The woman's gaze followed the dog, her expression softening in a way that suggested recognition. "He listens," she murmured. Daniel glanced back. "Better than most people," he said, and for the first time, a faint smile touched her lips, small but real. The kettle began to hum quietly, the sound rising in a slow, patient rhythm, and as Daniel prepared the tea, the room seemed to settle further, the storm becoming a distant presence rather than an immediate force. When he returned with the cup, he placed it carefully in her hands, ensuring her grip was steady before letting go. She nodded once in thanks, her fingers curling around the warmth as if drawing strength from it. Rex let out a low breath near the far wall, then tapped his paw once, twice, against a specific section of the floor, the sound subtle but distinct. Daniel's attention sharpened instantly. He crossed the room, kneeling beside the spot where Rex had stopped, running his hands slowly across the boards. Most of them felt solid, worn but secure, but one, near the baseboard, shifted slightly under pressure, not enough to be obvious, but enough to be noticed by someone who knew what to feel for. Daniel pressed again, testing the movement, his brow tightening just slightly. "What is it?" the woman asked, her voice calm, not alarmed. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Loose board," he said, keeping his tone neutral, but when he looked up, her eyes were already on him, steady, knowing. "Leave it," she said quietly, not as a command, but as something closer to a request shaped by time. Daniel held her gaze for a moment, sensing there was more beneath the words than what had been spoken. Rex remained still beside him, his ears angled slightly back now, not in fear, but in patience, as if he too understood that whatever lay beneath that floor was not meant to be uncovered in haste. Daniel withdrew his hand slowly, rising back to his feet, and the room fell into a deeper quiet, one that felt less like absence and more like anticipation, the kind that comes just before something long hidden begins to find its way into the light. And though the storm outside had not yet passed, Daniel felt a subtle shift within himself, a recognition that this night was no longer just about shelter from the rain. It was about something waiting beneath the surface, something that had already begun to move the moment Rex first listened. The minutes stretched quietly as the storm outside began to lose some of its edge, the wind no longer howling but settling into a steady, tired rhythm that brushed against the walls like something passing through rather than trying to break in. Inside, the small room held its own kind of stillness, the kind that forms when two lives that were never meant to cross find themselves sharing the same moment. Daniel leaned lightly against the edge of the kitchen counter, arms folded loosely, his posture relaxed on the surface but carrying the quiet alertness that never fully left him. Margaret sipped her tea slowly, each movement measured, her breathing more even now, color returning faintly to her cheeks. Rex had settled near the loose floorboard again, not touching it this time, just lying close enough that his presence seemed intentional, as if guarding something unseen rather than searching for it. The soft ticking of an old clock somewhere deeper in the house began to make itself known, subtle but steady, marking time in a way that felt almost deliberate. Margaret followed the sound for a moment before speaking again. "This house has a way of remembering things," she said, her voice low, almost reflective. Daniel glanced toward the hallway, his eyes tracing the dim outline of the space beyond. "Most places do," he replied, though his tone suggested he was not speaking only about walls and wood. She gave a faint nod, as if that answer had confirmed something she had already believed. The silence returned, but it was not empty. It carried weight, layers, something beneath the surface that neither of them rushed to uncover. Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears turning toward the back of the house, then toward Margaret, then back again, a quiet cycle of awareness that did not go unnoticed. Daniel watched him closely, reading the subtle shifts in posture, the small changes in breath. "He is still listening," Margaret said softly. Daniel looked at her, surprised not by the statement, but by the certainty in her voice. "He always does," Daniel answered, and, for a moment, there was something almost like agreement between them, not spoken, but understood. Margaret set the empty cup carefully on the small table beside her chair, her hands lingering on the edge as if grounding herself before continuing. "There are things in this house that do not belong to the storm," she said, her eyes drifting briefly toward the corner where the loose board rested beneath Rex's quiet watch. Daniel followed her gaze, but did not move. Something in the way she spoke made it clear that this was not an invitation to act, but a moment meant to be held, not rushed. "I have lived here a long time," she continued, "long enough to know the difference between what is passing through and what is meant to stay." Her voice did not waver, but there was a softness to it now, a layer of memory that seemed to stretch beyond the room itself. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, the old floor beneath him giving a faint creak, a reminder that everything here had endured time, in its own way. "And tonight?" he asked quietly, not pressing, just offering the question into the space between them. Margaret looked at him then, fully, her pale eyes clear despite the fatigue. "Tonight is not passing through," she said, and something in the way she spoke settled deep in the room. Rex let out a slow breath, lowering his head again, but keeping his eyes open, the kind of stillness that comes not from rest, but from waiting. Daniel felt it too, that subtle shift, the sense that whatever had begun when they crossed the threshold of this house had not reached its end, not even close. The storm outside continued to fade, the rain softening into a gentle pattern against the roof, but inside, something else was gathering, something quieter, something patient, something that did not need force to reveal itself, only time. And in that moment, Daniel understood without needing to say it, that this night was not about what had been saved, but about what had been waiting, perhaps for years, perhaps longer, for someone willing to listen closely enough to hear it. And for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to leave before the morning came. The night settled deeper into itself as the storm thinned into a distant whisper, the rain now falling in soft, uneven patterns that tapped gently against the roof like fingers remembering an old rhythm. Inside the house, the quiet had grown fuller, not empty but layered, as if every wall, every beam, every worn floorboard carried a memory that had been waiting patiently to be noticed. Daniel moved slowly through the small space, checking what could be secured before the damp air settled too. Far into the wood, his hands working out of habit, straightening a chair, adjusting the window latch, reinforcing the beam just enough to hold through the rest of the night, not to fix it completely, but to give it time, because sometimes time was the only repair that mattered. Behind him, Margaret watched in silence, her posture more relaxed now, her shoulders no longer held tight against the cold, the blanket resting around her like something familiar rather than borrowed. Rex remained near the corner, his body still, but his attention never fading, his gaze shifting now and then toward the hallway, then back to the floor beneath him, as if he was tracking something that moved not through space, but through meaning. Daniel paused for a moment, resting his hand against the back of a chair, the faint creak beneath his palm grounding him. "You have been here alone?" he asked quietly, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. Margaret took a slow breath, her eyes drifting toward the far wall where an old photograph hung slightly crooked. A younger version of her stood beside a man in uniform, both smiling in a way that belonged to a different time. "Not always," she said, her voice steady but softened by something deeper, "but long enough to learn the difference between loneliness and silence." Daniel followed her gaze, his eyes resting on the photograph just long enough to understand what she had not fully said. He nodded once, not pressing further, because some stories did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. The clock in the other room marked another minute, its steady ticking now a part of the space rather than something separate from it. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair, her hands folding together in her lap as if holding on to a thought she had carried for a long time. "There was a time," she began slowly, "when I thought the house was simply aging, the sounds, the movement, the way certain boards would settle or lift depending on the season." Her eyes moved again toward the corner, toward Rex, who had not moved from his place. "But then I realized, it was not the house changing. It was something within it waiting." Daniel listened without interruption, his expression unchanged but his attention fully present. Margaret's voice remained calm, but there was a quiet certainty beneath it now, the kind that comes from years of watching something unfold without needing to force it. "I stopped trying to understand it," she continued, "and started listening instead." Rex lifted his head slightly at those words, his ears turning forward, his body still grounded but alert. Daniel noticed the shift immediately, his gaze narrowing just slightly as he looked toward the floor again. The loose board remained where it was, unchanged, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what to look for. But in that moment, it felt less like part of the structure and more like a threshold, something that separated what was seen from what had yet to be revealed. "And what did you hear?" Daniel asked, his voice low, almost careful. Margaret looked at him then, not with hesitation, but with a quiet resolve that had been building long before this night began. "Not words," she said, "but timing." The answer lingered in the room, settling into the spaces between them. Daniel did not respond right away, because something about that word carried weight, something that reached beyond the moment and into everything that had led them here. The storm had brought him to this house. Rex had led him to that door. The voice had called at just the right moment. And now, this quiet, this waiting, it all felt connected in a way that logic could not fully explain. Rex let out a slow breath and rested his chin gently against the floor near the loose board, his eyes still open, still watching, as if he understood that whatever came next was not meant to be rushed. And Daniel, standing there in the soft, fading light of the storm's aftermath, felt it settle within him that this night was not about fixing what had broken, but about being present for what had been waiting. Because sometimes, the most important things do not reveal themselves when we search for them, but when we finally learn to stand still and listen. The night moved forward without announcement, slipping quietly from storm into stillness as if the world outside had decided it had said enough. The rain now reduced to a soft, occasional tapping that seemed less like weather and more like memory echoing against the roof. Inside, the house held a deeper calm, the kind that settles only after something unseen has shifted into place. Daniel remained where he stood for a long moment, his gaze resting not on Margaret, not on the walls, but on the space itself, as if trying to understand something that could not be measured or explained. Rex stirred gently, lifting his head from the floor and turning it toward Daniel, their eyes meeting briefly in that quiet, familiar exchange that had carried them through more than either of them spoke about. Then the dog rose slowly and stepped forward, not toward the door, not toward the hallway, but directly back to the loose floorboard, his movements deliberate, unhurried, his nose lowering once more to the narrow seam between the wood. This time, he did not simply observe, he pressed his paw firmly against it. Once, then again, the sound soft but unmistakable in the stillness. Daniel felt it before he moved, that subtle shift in the air, the sense that the moment Margaret had spoken of, the timing she had waited for, had arrived without needing to be called. He stepped closer, kneeling beside Rex, his hand resting lightly against the worn surface of the floor. The wood felt different now, not physically, but in presence, as if what had once been hidden beneath it was no longer content to remain unseen. Behind him, Margaret watched in silence, her posture upright despite her age, her expression calm, almost relieved, as though a long-held responsibility was finally reaching its end. Daniel glanced back at her briefly, a question unspoken but clear in his eyes. She gave a small, steady nod, not urging him forward, but no longer asking him to wait. That was enough. Daniel turned back, his fingers finding the edge of the board where it shifted ever so slightly. He pressed gently at first, testing the resistance. Then with a careful motion, he lifted. The wood gave with a soft creak, revealing a narrow space beneath, not deep, not dramatic, but intentional, as though it had been crafted for one purpose and one moment alone. Rex leaned in, his breath slow and steady, his presence close but not intrusive. Daniel reached inside, his hand brushing against something cool, solid, wrapped in cloth that had held its place through years of quiet waiting. He drew it out slowly, the fabric worn but intact, its edges folded with care. When he placed it on the floor beside him and unwrapped it, the room seemed to hold its breath again. Inside lay a small wooden box, simple in design, its surface marked by time, but not neglect, the grain of the wood smooth beneath his fingers, as if it had been touched often before being hidden away. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of fear, but out of respect for the moment itself. Then he opened it. Inside, resting with quiet dignity, were several items: a neatly folded letter, its paper aged but preserved, a small metal insignia worn at the edges, and a photograph. Daniel's eyes moved first to the photograph. Drawn by something he could not yet name, he lifted it carefully, the image revealing two men standing side by side, both in uniform, both younger, their expressions steady, grounded, the kind of expressions shaped by shared experience. Daniel's breath slowed as recognition began to form, not immediate, not overwhelming, but certain, like a memory rising through still water. Behind him, Margaret spoke softly, her voice carrying no strain now, only quiet truth. He waited a long time for someone to find that. Daniel did not look away from the photograph, his mind moving through places he had not visited in years. Rex sat back on his haunches, watching not the box, not the objects, but Daniel himself, as if this moment, more than anything else, was what he had been leading him toward. The house remained silent around them, no longer waiting, no longer holding, but releasing. And in that release, something within Daniel shifted as well, something long held, something that had never quite found its place until now. And though he had not come here searching for answers, he could feel it clearly, that whatever lay within that letter, within that box, was not simply a discovery, but a return, the kind that does not come when you are ready, but when the moment itself decides you have waited long enough. Daniel held the photograph a moment longer before setting it carefully beside the open box, his fingers moving with a quiet reverence that had nothing to do with the object itself and everything to do with what it carried. The room seemed to narrow around that small space on the floor, as if the rest of the house had stepped back to allow this moment to unfold without interruption. Rex remained still, his eyes fixed on Daniel's face, watching not for danger, but for change. Daniel reached for the folded letter next, the paper worn at the edges but protected, preserved with an intention that had survived years of waiting. He unfolded it slowly, the faint sound of paper moving through still air marking the only motion in the room. His eyes moved across the first lines, and something in his expression shifted, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but enough for Margaret to see. She did not move from her chair, did not ask what the letter said, because she already knew, not the words themselves, but the weight they carried. Daniel read in silence, the words forming a bridge between past and present, between what had been lost and what had been left behind. The name written near the beginning was one he had not spoken in years, not out of forgetfulness, but because some names carry more than memory, they carry responsibility, and sometimes regret. His breath slowed as he continued. each sentence unfolding not just information, but understanding. The letter spoke of a son, a man who had served, who had stood beside others in places where time moved differently, where choices did not always allow for second chances, and in those lines, Daniel found himself again, not as he was now, but as he had been then, standing in a moment that had never quite released him. The memory did not come sharply. It rose slowly, like something long submerged finding its way back to the surface, not to overwhelm, but to be seen. Rex shifted slightly, stepping closer until his shoulder brushed gently against Daniel's arm, grounding him, reminding him where he was. Daniel finished the letter without rushing, his eyes lingering on the final line longer than the rest, as if the meaning there needed more time to settle. When he lowered the paper, his hand remained still for a moment, the silence around him deeper now, fuller. Margaret spoke then, her voice soft but steady. He wrote that before he left. Daniel looked up at her, the connection now clear in a way it had not been before. Your son, he said quietly, not as a question, but as a recognition that had finally found its place. She nodded once, her gaze calm, not heavy with grief, but shaped by years of carrying it and learning how to live beside it. He told me about the men he served with, she continued, her eyes drifting briefly toward the photograph, about the ones who stayed and the ones who could not. Daniel felt the weight of that distinction settle within him, not as accusation, but as truth, simple and unadorned, the kind that does not demand explanation, only acknowledgement. He looked back at the insignia resting in the box, his fingers brushing against it lightly, recognizing the unit, the history, the shared ground that had once connected lives in ways that could not be undone. Rex lowered himself to the floor again, his presence steady, his breathing slow, as if he understood that this moment required stillness more than action. Margaret leaned back slightly, her hands resting calmly in her lap. He believed that what is left behind finds its way where it belongs, she said, her voice carrying a quiet certainty that had not wavered with time. Daniel held the letter carefully, folding it back along its original lines, not out of habit, but out of respect. The room remained silent, but it was no longer waiting, it was witnessing, and in that quiet, something within Daniel began to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to feel the difference. Like a weight adjusting, like a door that had been closed for too long finally opening just enough to let light in. And though nothing in the house had physically changed, everything about the moment felt different, because sometimes understanding does not arrive with noise or force. Sometimes it comes quietly, carried in the words of someone who trusted that the right person would find them when the time was finally right. The room remained still after the letter had been folded. The quiet no longer heavy with waiting, but softened by something closer to understanding. Daniel placed the paper back inside the wooden box with careful hands, setting the photograph beside it, and letting the insignia rest where it had been, nothing disturbed, nothing forced, as if the act of finding had been enough. Margaret watched him without speaking, her eyes calm, steady, carrying a sense of completion that did not need to be explained. The storm outside had nearly passed now. Only a light rain brushing against the windows, the kind that followed. Something larger, something that had already done what it came to do. Rex shifted slightly and moved away from the open floorboard. His task finished, his attention no longer fixed on what lay beneath, but on Daniel again, as if confirming that the path he had followed had reached its end. Daniel closed the box gently and rested it on the floor beside him, his gaze lingering on it for a moment before lifting toward Margaret. There was something different in his expression now, not relief. Exactly, but a quiet release, the kind that comes when something long carried finally finds its place. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her breathing slow and even, her hands resting loosely in her lap. He believed you would understand, she said softly. Daniel nodded once, not out of obligation, but because he did, not every detail, not every moment from the past, but enough to feel the meaning behind what had been left for him. The clock in the next room marked another minute, steady as ever, but now it felt less like time passing and more like time settling. Rex walked toward the doorway and paused, glancing back once before lowering himself near the threshold. His body relaxed, the tension that had guided him through the night finally easing. The house itself seemed to breathe differently now, the faint creaks and shifts no longer carrying a sense of anticipation, but of completion, as if something it had been holding had finally been released. Daniel rose slowly to his feet, brushing his hand lightly against the edge of the table as he stood, grounding himself in the present. He walked to the window and looked out, the clouds breaking just enough for a faint hint of early light to begin pressing against the horizon. The storm had moved on, leaving behind a quiet that felt earned rather than empty. Behind him, Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in weariness, but in rest, the kind that comes when something unfinished has finally reached its end. Daniel turned back toward her, his voice low, steady. "You waited a long time," he said. Margaret opened her eyes and met his gaze, a faint smile touching her lips. "Not for you," she replied gently, her eyes drifting toward Rex. "For him to find you." Daniel followed her gaze, understanding settling deeper than words could reach. Rex lifted his head slightly, acknowledging the look without needing to move, his presence quiet but certain. Daniel returned his attention to the box on the floor, the letter inside no longer just a message, but a bridge, something that connected what had been lost with what remained. He did not reach for it again, because he did not need to. The meaning had already found its place. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady, and in that moment, the room held a kind of peace that did not come from silence alone, but from something resolved, something completed, the kind of peace that does not demand attention, but fills the space quietly. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, letting it settle within him. The weight that had once followed him through years of distance now lighter, not gone, but understood, and sometimes that was enough. The house remained still around them, no longer waiting, no longer holding, but simply existing in the quiet that follows when everything that needed to be found has finally been seen. And as the first faint light of morning began to touch the edges of the world outside, it became clear that what had happened here was not something that would be spoken loudly or shared widely, but something that would remain steady and quiet, like the kind of truth that does not need to be proven, only carried forward in the way a man chooses to keep going after he has finally found what he did not know he was missing. Morning arrived quietly, not with brightness or sound, but with a slow, gentle light that slipped through the edges of the window and settled softly across the worn wooden floor. The storm had passed completely now, leaving behind a sky that felt washed clean, as if the night had carried something away that no longer needed to remain. Daniel stood near the window for a long moment, watching as the first pale gold of sunrise touched the trees beyond the house, their branches still heavy with rain, each drop catching the light in small, fleeting reflections. Rex rose from his place near the doorway and stretched slowly, his movements unhurried, his body no longer tense. The purpose that had guided him through the night now fulfilled. He walked back toward Daniel and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, a quiet presence that had never once needed words to be understood. Behind them, Margaret remained in her chair, her eyes closed, her breathing soft and even. There was a stillness around her now that felt deeper than rest, not fragile, not uncertain, but complete. Daniel turned slowly, something in his chest shifting as he looked at her. He stepped closer, careful, respectful of the quiet that had settled around her, and as he stood there, he understood without needing to reach out, without needing to call her name, that she had found her peace sometime between the storm and the morning, not in struggle, not in fear, but in the same calm certainty that had carried her through the night. Rex lowered his head slightly, his ears tilting back in a gesture that held no distress, only recognition, as if he too understood that this moment was not one of loss, but of completion. Daniel remained still for a while, not moving, not speaking, allowing the silence to hold what words could not. The house around them felt different now, lighter, as though the weight it had carried for years had finally been lifted. The faint creaks of the wood were softer. The air itself seemed clearer, and even the corner where the loose board had once drawn attention now felt ordinary again, its purpose fulfilled. Daniel moved at last, not out of urgency, but with a quiet sense of responsibility. He covered Margaret gently with the blanket, ensuring it rested around her shoulders the way she had held it the night before, a small, simple act that carried more meaning than it appeared. He stepped back, his eyes lingering for just a moment longer before turning away. The wooden box remained where he had left it, closed, still, no longer hidden, but no longer needing to be discovered. He picked it up carefully, holding it in both hands as he walked toward the door. Rex followed beside him, his steps steady, his gaze calm. As they stepped outside, the air felt fresh, cool, carrying the scent of rain and earth and something new beginning. The road stretched out ahead, quiet now, no longer swallowed by the storm. Daniel paused on the porch, looking back once at the house, not with hesitation,